Hi, my name is Yahya and welcome to yet another video. Today we are going to talk about the basics of photography. So let's get right into it. We as humans, we are innovators. You see, from how the bird flies, we learned how to create an aeroplane, and how the human eye sees, we learned how to create a camera. Yes, I understand that the functionality of how an eye works, it's kind of different from a human creation, the camera, but they kind of relate to each other. So in this approach of mine to help you understand the basics of photography, we are going to look at how an eye functions and try to connect that with how a camera works. In understanding photography, there are mainly three main things that you need to understand. And you need to understand and not just read the theory behind it. So the first thing is shutter speed, the second thing is aperture, and the third thing is ISO. So we're going to talk about all these three things. All of these three things, they're called the exposure triangle. And we're going to see that as we go on, why they're called the exposure triangle. Okay, so let's start with the first thing. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the sensor of the camera is exposed to light. You know what a shutter is, right? A shutter is like something that closes and opens. So a shutter speed is a mechanism built into cameras that opens and closes to allow light to pass in through. And shutter speed is mainly a derivative of time. So it is annotated in time, in seconds. So 1/50th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. Okay, and shutter speed controls two main things. Shutter speed controls how light enters the camera, the amount of light that enters the camera, and the second thing it controls is motion. Okay, so let's jump into the nitty-gritty of it. So in terms of exposure, or how much light the camera gets from the shutter speed, when you keep your shutter speed high, for example, a higher number of shutter speed, like 1/500th of a second or 1/4000th of a second, this increment, the higher the number, the more the shutter speed opens and closes fast. So it's going to allow less light to enter the sensor. And if the shutter speed is very low, so when you keep your shutter speed like 1/30th of a second or 1 second, one whole second, the shutter speed is going to open. It's going to stay open for one whole second, and this is going to allow more light to enter the camera. That's the first part that shutter speed controls exposure. The second part is shutter speed controls motion. How much motion do we have in our shot? Take for example, you're trying to shoot something like a bird flying. The bird doesn't fly in slow motion, right? It flies very fast. The motion happens very fast. In order for you to capture or stop that action into a still motion, you need a very high shutter speed, like something like 1/4000th of a second and more. Okay? So to stop motion, you need a high shutter speed, like a kid running. If you want to shoot your kid running, or you want to shoot something that happens very fast, droplets of water. In order for you to shoot something like droplets of water, you need a very high shutter speed. On the other hand, if the shutter speed is very low, what's going to happen is it's going to allow motion blur. Okay? It's going to allow motion blur. So for artistic photography, like if you have an ND filter, which is a subject we're going to cover in the next chapters, so stick around and don't forget to subscribe. Things like when you use an ND filter on your camera and you want to create motion with water in a landscape, you're gonna make your shutter speed considerably low. Or in things like astrophotography, when you need to shoot in very low light and capture the stars, your shutter speed is going to depend. Okay, in astrophotography it depends on the focal length of your lens, it's something that we're going to talk about later. But the lower the shutter speed, the more motion you're going to capture. And this happens also when you are shooting something, even if it's something still. For example, you're shooting a bottle of water. If you're shooting a bottle of water and you're using a very low shutter speed, like 1/50th of a second, that bottle of water, if you're shooting it handheld, a very slight movement of your arm is gonna cause motion blur in your photograph. So that's shutter speed. Now, to connect this shutter speed with the human eye, as I told you, the eyelids, they open and close like the shutter speed in the camera. Yes, they don't have the same function. Yes, they do not have the same function. However, for you to understand and remember what does shutter speed mean, you need to understand the human eyelid. The second part of understanding the exposure triangle is the aperture. So shutter speed, when we talked about shutter speed, we talked about the functionality of a camera. But aperture talks about the functionality of a lens. The design and how the lens was built is going to talk about the aperture. And aperture in optics, aperture is the opening or the hole that light passes through in optics. When you talk about optics, you talk about the lens, right? So in a lens, the aperture is represented in f-stops. We call them f-stops. And an f-stops in theoretical science, it's the ratio of the system focal length to the diameter of the lens. This is f-stops. And all lenses have two characteristics. They all have a maximum aperture and the minimum aperture. The maximum aperture is the highest number that the lowest number in arithmetic, but the widest hole it creates. So for example, if you say an f1.4, a lens with f1.4 maximum aperture, the number is lower, but it means that the hole is wider. The hole of the lens is wider. While something like an f22, it's going to be a minimum aperture. So the higher the number, it means the smaller the hole of the aperture. Aperture controls two main things too. All of these things, you'll see that they control light, exposure. So aperture also controls exposure. How? Since there is a wide hole, an aperture of something like f1.4 will let in more light into the sensor through the lens, and an aperture of f22 will let in less light through the lens. Okay, so it controls exposure. Aperture also controls depth of field. Depth of field, it's a whole other topic. It's a very huge topic. However, to understand depth of field, you need to understand one thing. If you keep your aperture at maximum aperture, something like at f1.4, the depth of field is gonna be very shallow. It's gonna be very shallow. That means that the background is gonna be blurry. Less of your subject is gonna be in focus, soft focus. And sometimes if you have foreground elements, then the foreground element is also going to be out of focus. And if you have an aperture of something like f22 or let's say f8, then the background is going to show, you're going to have more visibility of the background. The background is going to show much more at f22 or f8
than at f1.4. And also, since the depth of field is going to be wider, or a deeper depth of field, then you're going to have a lot more in focus, sharp focus. It is also imperative to note that most lenses, not all of them, most lenses, especially cheap ones, like if you have a nifty 50, it's gonna be sharp, tack sharp, 2 to 3 stops down. So something like f1.8 is gonna start to be sharp at f2 or f2.8, and it's gonna be tack sharp at f4. So this happens, but it's not always the case. Something like the RF 50mm 1.2, the new lens from Canon, it's sharp from f1.2 until something like f16. Everything is sharp. So this is how depth of field changes. It is also important to remember that some people use their lenses at f1.8 or f1.2, the maximum aperture, not because they don't see the softness in something like when you shoot something like a portrait. Some people like the character that the lens provides, so they're gonna leave it at f1.8 or f1.4. If now we take it to the human eye, in the human eye, the iris controls how much light passes into the human eye. It controls the pupil. It either dilates it, make it smaller or bigger depending on how much light it needs to let it in. So if you connect the human eye to the aperture in the camera, you're going to remember it easier. The third thing and last thing is ISO. ISO simply means how sensitive the camera is. How sensitive the camera is to light. Okay? Modern cameras nowadays have very good ISO performance, but old cameras, and most of the time also crop sensor cameras, if you increase the ISO, you're gonna have much more sensitivity to light. However, it's gonna introduce a lot of noise. Okay. Now, to put all of these things together, we come into a concept called the exposure triangle. All these three things work together to create a perfect image. So knowing when to increase one and when to reduce another in a different scenario is gonna help you start your journey in photography. So, for example, I'm gonna give you 2 scenarios, and we're gonna go through these 2 scenarios and see how will you change settings depending on your scenario, depending on what you're doing. So the first scenario, assume that you're outside, it's in the morning, and you're shooting your kid. Assume that you have a lens f1.8 lens, any focal length, and assume that there is ample light out there. So what are you going to do? Kids don't stay still, they run around. So what's the first thing you need to change? Since there is ample light outside, we're going to keep our ISO at minimum. We're going to increase the shutter speed until we get to a point that we can capture the movement without having too much motion blur. And the last thing, we're going to increase a little bit of the aperture to ensure that everything is tack sharp without sacrificing how much blurry background we can get, how much softness we can create with the image, how much depth we can create. The second scenario, try to understand it like this. Say you went to the beach and there is a landscape there and you want to shoot that landscape. You have a camera
it has a wide angle lens. The lens starts from like f2.8. How are you going to shoot that? How are you going to proceed shooting this landscape? So let's say there is ample light outside, or let's say it's sunset. You're going to increase the aperture. Let's say at f8 or f10 depending on the lens. This is gonna give you much more depth of field, much more in focus. Then you're going to adjust your shutter speed. If you have an ND filter, you're going to reduce the shutter speed to the number that gives you the amount of motion blur in the water or in the sky as you want. Then from there you're going to adjust your ISO, maybe lower it all the way or maybe increase it depending on the lighting situation. So these three things, they aren't a rule. It is important for you to understand these three things, how they work. And the only way for you to understand how these three things work is for you to go out and shoot. This is the only tip I give most beginners. Take your camera, go outside, go inside, just shoot. Because for you to have a practical understanding of how these settings work, you need to start shooting. And as I told you, photography is an art, and art is subjective. I've seen many photographers stick to the rules that every portrait needs to have the maximum shallow depth of field. You need to have like a very blurry background. That's not a rule. You can break rules as long as you understand them. So keep shining, keep being amazing, dare to dream, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.